My daughter-in-law said I ruined her life? The nurse looked at her and revealed the truth. The scream that came from room 247 at Vancouver General Hospital was the kind that makes your blood run cold. I know because I was standing right outside the door when my daughter-in-law Jennifer let it loose. But here's the thing that made my hands start shaking against the cold hospital corridor wall. She wasn't screaming because of pain. She was screaming at me. The words that came next, the ones that echoed down that sterile hallway and made 3 nurses look up from their station, were words I'll never forget. She said I ruined her life. She said everything that had gone wrong, everything that had led to this moment with her lying in that hospital bed, was my fault. And before you judge me, before you decide I'm just another bitter old man making excuses, I need you to hear what happened next. I need you to hear what the nurse said when she finally looked Jennifer in the eye and told her the truth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning is where all the lies started. My name is Robert Chen. I'm 68 years old, and up until 6 months ago, I thought I had a pretty good life. I'm a retired high school math teacher from Richmond, British Columbia. Spent 40 years teaching kids about algebra and geometry, and I was decent at it. Not amazing, not the kind of teacher who gets awards or makes the news, just decent. The kind who shows up every day, does his job, and goes home feeling like maybe he made a small difference. My wife, Margaret, died 4 years ago. Breast cancer took 18 months to kill her, and I was there for every doctor's appointment, every chemo session, every moment she needed me. After she died, I sold our house in Richmond because it was too big, too empty, too full of memories that made it hard to breathe. I bought a small condo downtown, something manageable, something that didn't remind me of her perfume in the bathroom or the way she used to hum while cooking dinner. My son, David, he's 42 now, and he seemed genuinely concerned about me after Margaret died. He'd call every few days, stop by on weekends, make sure I was eating properly, and not just sitting in the dark staring at old photo albums. I appreciated it. I really did. He's my only child, and after losing Margaret, he was all I had left. Then, about 2 years ago, David met Jennifer. She was 35, worked in marketing for some tech company downtown, and she was beautiful. I mean, the kind of beautiful that makes people turn their heads on the street. Long, dark hair, perfect smile, the kind of confidence that fills up a room. David was smitten from day one. He brought her to meet me about 3 months into their relationship, and I remember thinking she seemed nice enough. A little too interested in what I did for a living, what kind of retirement benefits teachers get, whether I owned my condo outright or still had a mortgage, but I chalked it up to her being curious, trying to get to know me, trying to understand the family she might be joining. They got married 8 months later. Quick, maybe too quick, but David was happy, and that's what mattered to me. I gave them $15,000 as a wedding gift, money I'd been saving for years, money I'd planned to use for travel or maybe a nicer place to live. But seeing David happy, seeing him start his life with someone he loved, that felt like a better use of the money. Margaret would have wanted that too. The first few months of their marriage seemed fine. They'd invite me over for dinner once a month, we'd make small talk, Jennifer would cook these elaborate meals and tell stories about her work, her friends, her plans for the future. But I started noticing things, small things at first. The way she'd steer conversations toward money, how she'd mention their mortgage payments, how expensive everything was in Vancouver, how hard it was for young couples to get ahead. David worked as a software engineer, made good money, and Jennifer's marketing job paid well too. They weren't struggling, but she talked like they were drowning. And she had this way of looking at me when she talked about money, like she was waiting for me to offer something, to volunteer to help. I didn't. Not because I didn't want to help my son, but because something about the way she asked, without actually asking, made me uncomfortable. Then, about 6 months ago, things changed. David called me on a Tuesday night, his voice tight with stress, and asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a Starbucks near my condo, and he looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, shoulders slumped, the kind of exhaustion that comes from more than just missing sleep. He told me they were having financial problems, real problems. Jennifer had apparently made some bad investments, something about cryptocurrency and a friend who'd promised guaranteed returns. They'd lost $80,000. $80,000. I almost choked on my coffee. I asked him how that was even possible, how someone could lose that much money without their spouse knowing. David's face went red, and he admitted he'd given Jennifer access to their joint savings, that she'd been managing their finances because she was better with money than he was. Better with money? She'd just lost 80 grand. He asked me if I could help them. Not for the full amount, he said quickly, just enough to keep them afloat while they figured things out. Maybe $20,000 or $30,000, just a loan. They'd pay me back. I sat there in that Starbucks, watching my son's hands shake around his coffee cup, and I felt my stomach sink. Because I knew what Margaret would say. She'd say, "Be careful, Robert." She'd say, "Something doesn't add up." She'd say, "Protect yourself before you try to save someone who might be drowning on purpose." But this was my son, my only child, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and walked down the aisle at his wedding. So I did something I knew might be stupid. I said yes, not to 30,000, but to 20. I told him I'd transfer the money that week, that he could pay me back whenever he was able. No pressure, no timeline. The relief on his face was immediate and overwhelming. He actually had tears in his eyes when he hugged me across the table. He said I was saving their marriage, that Jennifer had been so stressed about the money that they'd barely been speaking. He said this would fix everything. I transferred $20,000 from my retirement account to their joint checking account 3 days later. It hurt. That money was supposed to last me another 20 years, supplement my pension, make sure I could handle emergencies or health problems, or just basic living expenses as I got older. But I did it because he's my son, and I wanted to believe I was helping. Jennifer called me 2 days after the transfer went through. Her voice was sweet, dripping with gratitude, telling me I was the most generous father-in-law anyone could ask for, that she and David would never forget this, that they'd start paying me back as soon as they got back on their feet. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. It was too rehearsed, too perfect, like she'd practiced the speech in a mirror. For about 2 months, everything seemed okay. David said they were doing better, that Jennifer was being more careful with money, that they were working on a repayment plan for me. Then the calls started. First, it was Jennifer, asking if I'd heard from David's Aunt Linda, Margaret's sister, because apparently Linda had some old family jewelry that might be valuable. Then it was questions about my condo, whether I owned it outright, what it might be worth if I ever decided to sell. Then she started showing up at my place unannounced. She'd say she was in the neighborhood, just wanted to check on me, make sure I was doing okay living alone. But her eyes would wander around my condo, cataloging everything. And she'd ask pointed questions about my furniture, my electronics, whether I had a safety deposit box at the bank. I started to feel like I was being surveyed, like she was taking inventory of everything I owned, calculating its value, planning something I couldn't quite see yet. I mentioned it to David once, casually, asking if everything was okay with Jennifer because she seemed stressed. He got defensive immediately, said she was just being thoughtful, just trying to be a good daughter-in-law, that I was reading too much into things. So I dropped it. What else could I do? I couldn't exactly tell my son I thought his wife was planning to rob me blind. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks ago. Jennifer called me, her voice panicked, saying she was at the hospital, that something was wrong, that I needed to come right away. My heart stopped. I asked if David was okay, if he'd been in an accident. She said no, not David, it was her. She was at Vancouver General Hospital. She'd collapsed at work, the doctors were running tests, and David was stuck in a meeting across town and couldn't get there for another hour. She needed someone with her. She needed family. Could I please come? I was out the door in 5 minutes. Drove to the hospital, breaking probably half a dozen traffic laws, my mind racing with possibilities. Was she pregnant and having complications? Did she have a heart problem? Cancer? By the time I got to the emergency room and found her in room 247, my hands were shaking and my blood pressure was probably through the roof. I walked into that room expecting to find her hooked up to machines, pale and weak, maybe unconscious. Instead, she was sitting up in the hospital bed, fully dressed except for her shoes, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I came in and smiled. Not a weak, grateful smile, a calculating smile. And that's when I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. She put her phone down and looked at me with those cold eyes and said we needed to talk. I asked if she was okay, what the doctors had said, whether they'd found anything wrong. She waved her hand dismissively and said the doctors were still running tests, but that wasn't what she needed to talk to me about. She said she and David were in trouble again, serious trouble this time. The money I'd given them helped, she said, but it wasn't enough. They had debt collectors calling, threatening letters, their credit cards were maxed out, and David might lose his job because the stress was affecting his performance. She needed more money, a lot more. She said she needed $50,000. $50,000! I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd, so audacious. That laughter was the only response I could manage. I told her I didn't have $50,000 to give her. I told her the $20,000 I'd already given them had seriously depleted my savings, that I was living on a fixed income, that I needed that money to survive. She looked at me then with something ugly in her eyes, something mean. And she said I could get it. I could take out a reverse mortgage on my condo. I could borrow against my pension. I could ask David's Aunt Linda for money. I could sell things. There were ways. I just had to want to help my son badly enough. I felt my face get hot. I told her no, absolutely not. I told her I'd already helped more than I could afford, that whatever financial problems she and David had were theirs to solve, not mine. I told her I loved my son, but I wasn't going to destroy my own financial security to bail them out of a mess she'd created with her reckless spending. That's when she started screaming. I mean really screaming, loud enough that I took a step back toward the door. She screamed that I was selfish, that I was a terrible father, that David had been right about me all along. She screamed that I'd never really supported their marriage, that I'd never liked her, that I was just a bitter old man who couldn't stand to see his son happy. She screamed that Margaret would be ashamed of me, that my dead wife would be disgusted by how I was treating my only child. And then she said the words that made my blood turn to ice. She screamed that I'd ruined her life. She screamed that everything that was wrong, everything that had led to this moment, was my fault. If I'd just given them the money they needed when they first asked, they wouldn't be in this position. If I'd been a better father, a more generous person, they wouldn't be drowning in debt. She screamed that the stress I'd caused had made her sick, that her being in this hospital was because of me, that I was literally killing her with my selfishness. I stood there, frozen, watching this woman I barely knew have a complete meltdown in a hospital room, blaming me for problems I didn't create, demanding money I didn't have. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to defend myself against accusations that made no logical sense but were delivered with such conviction that part of me started to wonder if maybe she was right. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I should have done more. That's when the nurse walked in. Her name was Patricia, according to her badge, and she was maybe 50 years old, with short gray hair and the kind of face that had seen everything twice. She took one look at Jennifer screaming at me and held up her hand. She said in a voice that cut through the noise like a knife that Jennifer needed to calm down immediately or security would be called. Jennifer stopped mid-scream, her mouth hanging open, her face red and blotchy. Patricia walked over to the bed, picked up the chart hanging from the footboard, and read it carefully. Then she looked at Jennifer with the coldest expression I've ever seen on a medical professional's face. Patricia said she'd just reviewed all of Jennifer's test results, every single one. Blood work, urine analysis, EKG, chest x-ray, the works. And would Jennifer like to know what they found? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Jennifer was in perfect health. No infections, no deficiencies, no cardiac issues, no organ problems, nothing that would explain why she'd collapsed at work or why she was in the hospital at all. In fact, Patricia said, the doctors were fairly certain Jennifer hadn't collapsed at all. The paramedics' report indicated that when they'd arrived at Jennifer's office, she was conscious, coherent, and refusing to go to the hospital until her coworkers insisted. There was no loss of consciousness, no actual medical emergency, just a woman who'd said she felt dizzy and needed to lie down. The room went completely silent.
I could hear the beeping of a monitor from another room down the hall. Jennifer's face had gone from red to white, all the color draining out like someone had opened a valve. Patricia wasn't done. She said she'd been a nurse for 27 years, and in that time, she'd seen a lot of things. Real emergencies, real suffering, real fear. And she'd also seen people fake medical crises for attention, for sympathy, for money. She said the hospital staff had noticed that Jennifer had made 3 calls from the ER that afternoon before I arrived. One to her husband, one to me, and one to someone named Marcus, asking if he'd gotten the paperwork ready yet. Patricia said she didn't know what that meant, but she suspected it had nothing to do with actual medical care. Jennifer tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but Patricia cut her off. She said I should know that Jennifer had asked 3 different staff members if they knew how much hospital bills typically cost for someone without good insurance. She'd asked if the hospital ever set up payment plans that required family members to co-sign. She'd asked if there were any forms that would allow a relative to be held financially responsible for her care. Patricia looked right at me when she said this, and I felt my legs go weak. This whole thing had been a setup. The hospital, the emergency, the screaming, all of it. Jennifer had faked a medical crisis to get me to the hospital, to corner me, to manipulate me into giving her more money out of guilt and fear. I looked at Jennifer and she looked back at me with pure hatred in her eyes. No more tears, no more playing the victim, just cold, calculating rage that she'd been caught. I asked her in a voice that didn't sound like mine how long she'd been planning this, how long she'd been setting me up. She didn't answer. She just stared at me. Patricia cleared her throat and said she'd be filing a report about this incident, that falsifying medical emergencies was a serious matter, and that if Jennifer wanted to contest her findings, she was welcome to request a full psychiatric evaluation. Jennifer grabbed her shoes and her purse and walked out of that room without another word. Just walked right past me, past Patricia, out into the hallway and disappeared. I stood there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. Patricia put her hand on my arm and told me to sit down before I fell down. She brought me a cup of water and told me I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told her I felt like I had. The woman I thought was my daughter-in-law, the woman I'd given $20,000 to, the woman I'd worried about and tried to help, was a complete stranger. Worse than a stranger, a con artist. Patricia nodded like she'd expected exactly this reaction. She told me I should talk to my son as soon as possible, that I should protect my finances, and that I should probably contact a lawyer. She said she'd seen this kind of thing before, families torn apart by someone who saw relationships as transactions, who measured love in dollar signs. I left the hospital in a daze, drove home on autopilot, nearly missed 2 red lights, couldn't remember the drive once I was parked in my building's garage. I sat in my condo that night, lights off, staring at my phone, trying to figure out what to say to David. How do you tell your son that his wife is a fraud? How do you explain that the woman he loves, the woman he married, is systematically trying to destroy his family for money? I finally called him at 9 o'clock. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice tight with anger. He'd already talked to Jennifer. She'd told him her version of what happened at the hospital. According to her, I'd gone there and verbally abused her while she was sick, told her she was faking, made her so upset that she left against medical advice. She told David that I'd always hated her, that I'd been waiting for a chance to drive a wedge between them, that I was a toxic presence in their marriage. I told David the truth, every word of it. I told him about Patricia, about the test results, about Jennifer asking staff members about payment plans, about the phone call to someone named Marcus. I told him this had all been a setup to get more money out of me. David was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that broke my heart. He said he believed Jennifer. He said I'd never given her a fair chance, that I'd been cold to her from the start, that this was just me trying to sabotage his happiness because I couldn't move on from Mom's death. He said if I couldn't support his marriage, maybe we needed some space from each other. Then he hung up. I sat in the dark for hours after that call, thinking about everything I'd done wrong as a father. wondering if David was right, if I had been cold to Jennifer, if my grief over Margaret had made me suspicious and bitter. But then I thought about Patricia's face, about the test results, about Jennifer's cold eyes when she demanded $50,000. And I knew I wasn't wrong. My son was being manipulated by someone who was very, very good at it. I just didn't know how to prove it. The next morning, I did something I should have done months ago. I hired a private investigator. His name was Michael Torres, recommended by a colleague from my teaching days whose daughter had used him during a difficult divorce. I told Michael everything. He listened without interrupting, took notes, and told me he'd start digging. 2 weeks later, he called me with information that made me physically sick. Jennifer's real name was Jennifer Hartley Morrison, and she had a history. 3 previous relationships, all with older men or men with family money. In each case, she'd gotten engaged or married quickly, created financial emergencies, extracted money, and disappeared. One ex-boyfriend had filed a police report claiming she'd stolen $50,000 from his elderly mother by claiming she needed money for medical treatments. No charges were filed because the mother refused to testify, said she'd given the money willingly. Another ex-fiancé had a restraining order against her after she'd emptied their joint bank account and tried to take out credit cards in his name. Michael found something else, too. The person Jennifer had called from the hospital, Marcus, was Marcus Chen. My son's name is David Chen. Marcus Chen was Jennifer's ex-boyfriend from 5 years ago. They'd never stopped talking. Michael had phone records, text messages, emails. Jennifer and Marcus had been planning this for months. The cryptocurrency losses that started everything? Fake. There was no lost $80,000. Jennifer had moved that money to an offshore account she shared with Marcus. The whole thing had been designed to drain David's savings first, then come after me. The hospital stunt was supposed to be the emotional manipulation that broke me, that made me liquidate everything to help my dying daughter-in-law. Except Patricia had seen through it, and the whole plan fell apart. I took all of this evidence to David, showed up at his house unannounced on a Saturday morning, and laid it all out on his kitchen table. Bank statements, text messages, background checks, police reports from Jennifer's previous victims. I watched his face as he read through everything, watched the color drain away, watched his hands start to shake. Jennifer wasn't home, thankfully. She was at a yoga class or shopping or wherever she went when she wasn't actively destroying lives. David looked up at me with tears streaming down his face and asked why I hadn't told him sooner. I explained I'd only just found out, that I'd hired the investigator after the hospital incident. He asked how he'd missed all of this, how he'd been so blind. I told him love makes us blind sometimes, that none of this was his fault, that Jennifer was a professional and he'd just been unlucky enough to be her target. We talked for 3 hours, about everything. About how Jennifer had isolated him from his friends, convinced him his coworkers were jealous of him, made him doubt his own judgment about money and decisions. Classic manipulation tactics. David admitted he'd been feeling crazy for months, like he couldn't trust his own thoughts, like everything he did was wrong. That's what she wanted. That's how people like Jennifer operate. They make you question reality until you're so dependent on them for validation that you'll do anything they say. David said he wanted her gone, out of his house, out of his life, immediately. I told him to be smart about it, get a lawyer first, protect his assets, file for divorce with the evidence we had so she couldn't claim anything in the settlement. Don't confront her until the legal paperwork was ready. He did exactly that. Within a week, he had a lawyer, had frozen their joint accounts, had filed for divorce citing fraud and misrepresentation. When Jennifer found out, she tried to play victim one more time. Showed up at my condo crying, saying it was all a misunderstanding, that Marcus was just a friend, that she'd made mistakes but she loved David and wanted to fix things. I didn't let her in, told her through the closed door.
That if she didn't leave immediately, I'd call the police and show them the evidence of her fraud. She stood outside my door for 10 minutes, alternating between crying and threatening, before finally leaving. I haven't seen her since. The divorce was finalized 2 months ago. David got everything because Jennifer couldn't contest anything without admitting to fraud. She disappeared after that.
Michael Torres told me she'd moved to Calgary, probably looking for new victims, new families to destroy. David and I are rebuilding our relationship. It's slow. There's damage there, trust that needs to be repaired on both sides. He apologized for not believing me, for choosing Jennifer over his own father. I apologized for not seeing the signs sooner, for not protecting him better. We have dinner once a week now. Sometimes we talk about what happened, sometimes we don't. He's in therapy, working through the trauma of being married to someone who saw him as nothing but a mark. He's doing better. Not great yet, but better. And here's what I learned through all of this. Sometimes the people who scream the loudest about being victims are the actual predators. Sometimes the person saying you ruined their life is really angry that you didn't let them ruin yours. Jennifer stood in that hospital room and blamed me for everything, screamed that I'd destroyed her life, when the truth was she'd been systematically trying to destroy mine and got caught. Patricia, that nurse who saw through Jennifer's act, she probably saved me from losing everything. If she hadn't walked in at that exact moment, if she hadn't had the courage to call out what she was seeing, I might have given in. I might have taken out that reverse mortgage. I might have bankrupted myself trying to fix a problem that didn't exist. I think about that sometimes, how close I came to losing everything. My savings, my home, my relationship with my son. All because I wanted to help. All because I believed that family helps family, no matter what. And that's still true. Family should help family. But Jennifer was never family. She was a predator wearing a daughter-in-law costume, and she almost got away with it. If you're watching this and something sounds familiar, if you've got someone in your life who's always in crisis, always needs just a little more money, always blames you when they don't get what they want, please be careful. Please ask questions. Please trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Because people like Jennifer are out there. They're good at what they do. They're convincing. They know exactly how to push your buttons, how to make you feel guilty, how to make you believe that love means bankrupting yourself for their benefit. It doesn't. Love doesn't demand financial destruction. Love doesn't manipulate or threaten or lie. And if someone is asking you to prove your love by giving them money, by destroying your security, by choosing them over your own well-being, that's not love. That's exploitation. I'm 68 years old, and I spent most of my adult life teaching teenagers about numbers and equations. But the most important lesson I've learned has nothing to do with math. It's this. You can't help someone who's trying to hurt you. You can't save someone who sees you as prey. And you can't love someone into being a good person if they're determined to be a bad one. Jennifer told everyone I ruined her life. The truth is, I was just the one who wouldn't let her ruin mine. The nurse in room 247 looked at her and revealed the truth that day, and it changed everything. Sometimes the truth hurts. Sometimes it destroys relationships and exposes ugly realities. But it's still better than living a lie. It's still better than being someone's victim. And if my story helps even one person recognize the warning signs, helps one person protect themselves from someone like Jennifer, then maybe sharing all of this was worth it. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or helped you see something clearly, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Not for me, but because stories like this need to be told. Because someone watching right now might be in a situation like mine and needs to know they're not crazy, they're not wrong, and they're not alone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's survival.